And now we are joined by Asa Winstanley, an investigative journalist with the Electronic Intifada. Asa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for me.
Asa, you've been covering these accusations of anti-Semitism for years now, and we finally see Jeremy Corbyn being suspended from the Labour Party after enduring years of these smear attacks. Can you explain to us how we got to this moment?
Well, the immediate cause today was a report by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, which is a statutory equality body, which it has status in the law in the UK. It's supposed to be an anti-racist organisation, but it's come under attack and criticism by a wide range of people. And actually, some of the best reporting on it I've seen, strange enough, is in Newsweek, which says that has some pretty convincing arguments that the EHRC is far too close to the ruling Conservative Party, and has refused to take action on anti-black racism and Islamophobia, and has refused to criticize the police, for example, as institutionally anti-Semitic, although they very much are in this country. And the EHRC last year was asked by two Israel lobby groups, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism and the Jewish Labour Movement, to investigate the Labour Party for what they claimed was institutional anti-Semitism. And the report was issued this morning, and it, after years of invective in the media and the Israel lobby of claims that the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn had become anti-Semitic, that it was extremist, that there were all these terrible people in the Labour Party. The report found what it claimed were two cases of what it called illegal harassment against Jews, and it's unspecified Jewish people as well. And Jeremy Corbyn then issued quite a measured statement. I mean, in my view, it was an over generous statement, and he's reiterating his opposition to anti-Semitism, saying anti-Semitism is absolutely abhorrent, which of course it is, and saying that the EHRC report shows that I took action against anti-Semitism and so on and so forth, and people claiming that it's exaggerated or wrong and so forth. But then he said, one anti-Semite is too many, but the scale of the problem was also dramatically overstated for political reasons by our opponents inside and outside the party, as well as much of the media. And that's just a blandly factual statement. If anything, it underplays the media campaign against him for the last 5 years, which hasn't stopped, even though he was opposed as the Labour leader. Well, he quit as Labour leader earlier this year after failing to win the general election in December. So after that statement, there was then calls by Israel lobby groups and by the media in a press conference with Keir Starmer, the current leader of the Labour Party, for Corbyn to be suspended, and he was, quite swiftly, actually. And I think the swiftness of the suspension has surprised a lot of people.
We know that a lot of members of the Labour Party aren't going to be happy with this decision. Do you think that they should remain in the Labour Party and try to change it from within, or do you think that they should explore avenues of change outside of the political system?
I joined the Labour Party myself, but last year I really saw no opportunity but to quit myself because I was essentially being harassed out of the Labour Party. And, that's happened to a lot of people, who have been falsely accused of anti-Semitism. Look, my view is both, I suppose. I mean, try whatever avenues you can, but I do think ultimately it seems to be a losing battle within the Labour Party. I don't really see much hope for the Labour Party becoming a party for change. The Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn opening up to left-wing policies which improve most people's lives, and start to reverse the tide of neoliberalism and even more so, finally questioning Britain's imperialist legacy, which was not only supported by the Labour Party historically, but actually the British Empire was run for brief periods by the Labour Party, by Labour Party governments. You know, some terrible crimes of the British Empire were carried out by Labour governments, including in Africa and Asia. So, you know, the Labour Party, led by Jeremy Corbyn, now looks like a brief blip, a brief interlude in a long history of the Labour Party's involvement in these terrible things. And the reason that it's this so-called anti-Semitism crisis refuses to die is because the powers that be, you know, the British establishment, even I would argue British intelligence services, the permanent security state, want to ensure that something like that never happens again inside a mainstream political party which claims to represent the views of working people in this country. They just want to ensure that, well, I mean, this is the maximal result, is getting him out of the party altogether. But I don't think it's going to end there. Time and time again, we've seen and we've thought, activists have thought, okay, well, they've had enough now. You know, they've made their point, they'll back off. But that never happens. You know, there's no bottom to this. Israel lobby groups, especially, who are part of the wider right in this country, always have the policy of refusing to take yes for an answer. They pocket the results and then demand more. And that's what will keep happening. I think this is what we've seen today with the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn is only the start in some ways. I think there will be a wider purge now of the remaining left-wing Labour MPs in the party. It's going to be quite fratricidal inside the Labour Party for some time, I think.
So the Trades Union Congress, which is a group of unions with over 5.5 million members, voted overwhelmingly to oppose Israeli apartheid. The Black Lives Matter UK movement this summer, in this global uprising against racism, expressed their support for the Palestinian people and called Israel a settler colonial state. Do you think that the suspension is going to be popular in the UK?
No, it won't be popular amongst people. Like, Jeremy Corbyn's policies were always very popular. You know, there's absolutely no doubt about that. And under the adverse conditions of the global pandemic, which has been particularly badly handled in this country by the Conservative government, even the Tory government has been forced to adopt some aspects of Labour policies, in terms of they've had no other option rather than complete collapse of the country, essentially, to support people with furlough payments and so forth. Although it hasn't gone far enough by any means, it's ended far too long, and there's been quite a chaotic response. So Jeremy Corbyn's policies were always popular, although he himself personally was quite successfully demonized by the popular press. But I think that it remains to be seen whether there's a political will to do what really needs to be done, I think, which is to set up a real left-wing party, which is, I mean, look, what happened with Jeremy Corbyn was, as I said, it was a sort of historical anomaly. And what he got his power from, why he was different as a politician was he had mass movements behind him. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the comparison, because obviously the political differences and history are quite great, but in some limited respects, it reminds me of Bolivia to an extent, in that the mass in Bolivia is not just a political party, but it comes from social movements and popular movements and indigenous rights movements and so on. Now, the Labour Party is absolutely not that, but the movement behind Corbyn was kind of an attempt to capture the Labour Party, really. But the kind of conspiracy theory that was in the mainstream media all the time was that there was this Trotskyist, entryist plot to do that by this kind of, you know, shadowy elite of hard left anti-Semites. That was completely untrue, But what there was an attempt by mass movements of people from movements like, especially movements that Corbyn has always been involved in, like the anti-war movement, the movement for equal rights against racism, for refugee rights, the Palestine solidarity movement. All these mass movements, which at times have been able to really mobilize themselves in the streets over the years. And, Corbyn's always been involved in those campaigns. When Corbyn was put forward as the left-wing leadership candidate in 2015, almost as an afterthought, there was immediate, mass activist support for him. Why? Because they knew him. They knew Corbyn. They knew who he was because he'd sat next to them. He chaired their meetings. He'd spoken to their rallies, and he'd hosted their meetings in Parliament. In some cases, when very few or no MPs would, especially the Palestine solidarity movement. There was a time. Things have changed now, as you've sort of described. There is much far too slow, but there is much greater hegemony in a way for the Palestinian cause in this country on the popular level, but that hasn't yet translated to any kind of political power. And in those times, until only really a few years ago, it was very, very hard for the Palestine Solidarity movement or other Palestine Solidarity campaign or other Palestine Solidarity groups in this country to get meetings with MPs, meetings hosted in Parliament that had this sort of institutional respectability to them. And Corbyn was one of few to do that. So, there was an attempt to kind of make the Labour Party, to seize the Labour Party from these sort of desiccated right-wing corporate elites represented by people like, especially Tony Blair, was kind of the apex of that, the former Labour leader, who Margaret Thatcher celebrated as one of her greatest successes, and to kind of reclaim Labour for the people. There was kind of an attempt to do that, but it was almost spontaneous. I wouldn't say entirely spontaneous, but it wasn't planned. It was a response to unexpected events, that's now unfortunately failed and been smashed.
So these left-wing forces that Jeremy Corbyn brought into the party, the movement for Palestinian rights, do you think all of these left-wing social forces could culminate into a larger political force?
Yes, absolutely it could happen. It's very hard to see, especially on such a bleak day as today. But what I do keep coming back to personally, and it is just a fact, is that the whole Corbyn phenomenon, in terms of the movement behind him, was completely unexpected. Even Corbyn didn't expect to win. And this sort of semi-spontaneous movement, which again has years of roots in these sort of popular movements, just coalesced all of a sudden. So something like that can happen again. There was a whole reservoir of people who had left the Labour Party. And now we have, in some respects, with especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, there is a real mass appetite for change, and the Black community in this country, the Labour Party really takes their votes for granted, So I think there's definitely an appetite for change in this country that is not being met by the Labour Party. So there is definitely big potential there to be grasped, but the question remains, who's going to do that? Corbyn today has said the obvious candidate, in a way, would be Corbyn to lead a new Labour Party, but he's always been Labour through a new independent Labour Party or something. But he's always been Labour through and through, even through the Tony Blair years. He stayed with the party, and today he said he's going to fight the expulsion, which, of course he should do because it's completely unjust. But at the same time, if he did just say, okay, well, I'm going to start my own party and we're going to campaign against Labour and we're going to try, we're going to just go for it, there would have to be some sort of strategy that'd have to be changed and so forth. But that's certainly a potential. That's something with a potential to succeed, because it's not just this activist and these mass movements that I'm talking about. He showed in 2017 that he could cut through to the electorate like no other Labour leader has ever done. And that is indisputable. So unfortunately, he doesn't seem to. It's so in a lot of ways like Bernie Sanders. He doesn't. He's too nice, and he doesn't have the killer instinct.